Thank you for a nice introduction. I don't think that I'm really anything special, anybody special. By a lovely coincidence, it happened in my life that I could spend some time in those two great powers, but one of them really great power, the United States, the other one trying to reach again this level, but unfortunately for Russians, it's just the unsuccessful attempt, constant successful attempt, unsuccessful attempt. They are pretending how powerful they are. Unfortunately, they are not in the position to really be so dangerous like the USSR used to be, but we need to be very careful about them because they are it's very hard to predict, they are quite unpredictable. As was said by Jiří, I would have a few introductory remarks and then we could have a debate. The relations between West and Russia, or before the USSR, Soviet Union, are in the last decades like up and down. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we saw some attempt of Russians, mostly linked with President Yeltsin, to democratize their country and to become the part of the normal, so-called normal, predictable, normally readable part of world. Our perception at that time, I mean the West, because at that after the Velvet Revolution, the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia first, and then the Czech Republic and Slovakia started to be integrated slowly into the West and first the Nato and then European Union. So we perceived ourselves as a part of West. So when I'm speaking about West, I mean also my country. The West perceives the democratization in Russia like something quite promising. Of course, we saw that there were some unsuccessful attempts to really implement something was very important for democratic country of our style, the liberal democracy of the Western style. It means rule of law. So for many Russians, those 90s, which were perceived by us as a kind of the hopeful attempt to democratize, was perceived as a total chaos and the lack of dignity and lack of respect from outside. So that's why many Russians are using for this democratization their own expression. They call it dermokratizacja, not demokratizacja, but dermokratizacja. What this dermo means in Russian language, the excrement, you would say in your nice American English, kind of the shit. So they perceive this democratization like total failure, like something what really was against their traditional values, like something what meant that they were not receiving those salaries, that the country was in the chaos. The Soviet Union was just the question of the history, and the privatization in Russia means finally oligarchization. That only for few people that was something what really had from what they have been profiting. Then after this Yeltsin era, and you know before that Gorbachev's era was also perceived later on by Russians like a total failure because Mr. Gorbachev actually is the guy who is guilty for the collapse of the Soviet Union. something what Mr. Putin later on said that was one of the most terrible geopolitical tragedies of the 20th century. And in Russian tradition, the good Tsars are those who expand with their territory. Bad Tsars are those who are losing territory. It doesn't matter if they are by expanding, killing millions of people, or sending them to gulags or to the guillotines, but if they expand, it means that from the perspective of the history, they are successful. So Ivan Grozny was successful, Stalin was successful leader, but Gorbachev and Yeltsin are losers from the perspective of the ordinary Russian, I would say. Not intellectuals, but they are a relatively small group in Russia. So the ordinary Russian would say that those two presidents, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, are losers. Now they have Putin. Putin became the president in a very bizarre situation. He was chosen in the last, some people are saying, in the last minutes against Nemtsov because of promises he made to Yeltsin's family. I'm not the criminologist, so I'm not sure how it really how it happened. But simply, this guy who used to be working with Sobchak, the liberal mayor of St. Petersburg, became then kind of the assistant of Mr. Yeltsin, and then he became his successor. And it's true that from the very beginning he started to bring kind of the order into the country. And ordinary Russians started to perceive this guy as a kind of hope that he would bring back the dignity and order and respect. That's something what Russians desperately are looking for all the time. Order, dignity, and respect from outside. And he started to stabilize the society and economy. And it's true that the growth of economy at this era, Putin's era, is unprecedented. It used to be unprecedented. Never in Russian history Russia was so prosperous, and so many Russians would be able to say that they are having a relatively comfortable life. From our perspective, it's of course different, but from their perspective, they used to live in a stabilized society. Putin started to stabilize it. The economy was growing. Foreign investors were coming into Russia, investing their money, building kind of capitalism. It's hard to call it free markets, but honestly, Russians who were receiving their salaries, who were having some of them even nice jobs because of the foreign investment in Russia, they were receiving money which they were able to spend for something what never ever in their history had in their shops. So there were some kind of goods, some sort of imported food or clothes and other things, which are cars, which never in the bravest imaginations of ordinary Russian they would have in their own country, and they were suddenly having money to buy it and to travel. So for many Russians, Mr. Putin became the symbol of stability and prosperity. Also, we in the West were actually, some of us were perceiving Mr. Putin as kind of the guarantee that Russia would be not failing state, that it would be not more atomized in the future, and that we could really cooperate so that we can create some partnership with Russia. You may remember, I'm not able to quote it because I don't remember the exact words, but what President Bush Jr. was saying about Putin, that he believes that when he look in his eyes, that he believes that this guy is good for Russia and good for our partnership. Madeleine Albright, who was at that time in the opposition, was saying once she looks in the Putin's eyes, she always sees the KGB agent, cold-blooded KGB agent. So two perspectives from one country. But it's true that the West is having, and the United States especially, is having kind of constructivism, that we are always trying to see something better and to project our hopes into our partners. So we believe that they could really work with us as partners, that we could rely on them, and we are trying our best to offer the substance for such a cooperation. Sometimes it's failure, sometimes it works, but in case of Russia, unfortunately, it looks like a constant mistake we are doing, and that's why we have in this West Russian history those ups and downs. It's true that with Putinism, in the first part of his governance, we were really linking a lot of our hopes, and I would say that was quite legitimate. He also was sending some signals that he would like to have Russia integrated even into NATO. I remember when I spoke to Madeleine Albright about it, she said, well, it was very hard to answer realistically to those requests from Russia that this is impossible now, and from many reasons, because they were saying, okay, if we want to be partners, so why we shouldn't be allies? And if we want to be in NATO, why you shouldn't accept us? And it was quite hard to explain that they need to first meet some criteria. They need to do something what any other member of NATO must do. That they are obliged to follow some measures which are for all the members the same. Because they were saying, but yeah, we are here, we are powerful, and we are offering our serious partnership, but we need to be part of NATO. President Clinton was challenged several times later on by them, asking questions, so why you don't want us to be in? If you say that we are not enemies anymore, so why we could be not part of NATO? And it's really hard sometimes to explain to our Russian partners that we are not so naive that we can believe that the one day KGB agent could be the day after the real Democrat and convinced ally of the West. This first part of the Putinism was something like testing each other a bit, you know, what we can do together and what kind of partnership we could build together. And as Russia was growing, and thanks to foreign investment and thanks to their resources, natural resources, was becoming wealthier and wealthier, the self-confidence of Russians and Mr. Putin was growing, and well, suddenly they came to the conclusion that they don't need to be members of NATO if we are not ready to offer them the full membership. That they could be on their own, they could become again the superpower, and they could restore this policy of balancing between West and East. And unfortunately, I would say that we again, we as a West, we are part of this problem, because as the Russian ambitions were growing, and they were more and more speaking about return of Russia towards the traditional values, Russian traditional values, we were, some of our politicians were saying, okay, it's natural, this is the Russian patriotism which we need to respect, they have their legitimate interests, they have their legitimate sphere of interests, and we need to respect those spheres of interests. So, you know what happened in 2008. It's a nice chronological example what could happen if we ignore the lessons of history we learned, and especially this nation, Czechs, should remember quite well that if you don't stand up against the evil, that appetite of evil is growing. In 2008, there was a Bucharest summit of NATO where Ukrainian and Georgian delegations were coming to Bucharest with the hope that they would be offered start of negotiations about the full membership. And you know how it ended up. Those two delegations had to leave Bucharest without anything. And thanks mostly to German and French diplomacy, actually the offer to start negotiations about NATO membership was just an empty bubble. And in Moscow, they rightly read it, they perceive it rightly like the gesture of weakness from the West, that we are not ready to support Ukraine and Georgia and accept their full membership in NATO because we are afraid of Moscow, that we don't want to irritate Moscow. The natural reaction was quite clear. Well, the West is weak, West is not ready to challenge us, so we can do whatever we want. So let's invade Mr. Saakashvili and his Georgia. So shortly after the Bucharest summit, the same year in August, we had an invasion to Georgia. What happened then? Instead of showing our firm opposition to that, rejection of such a military activity of Russia, newly elected President Obama came with, and Michael McFaul was the architect of that plan, came with their plan of reset of relations with Russia. You remember when Obama was doing his campaign, he spoke about reaching out, that America needs to offer its hand, not showing the fist, only to offer the hand to our enemies and to convince them that America doesn't want to be the only sheriff of the world and that they could be partners, we could respect each other, we could work together, and we doesn't need to be in war. In Russian tradition, if you may read the Russian classical literature, you know that after the crime there should be the punishment, penalty. And after crime they made against Georgia, what's the act of the international crime, instead of punishment and showing them teeth and muscles, we came with by this reaching out and with this offer to reset our relations. And I believe that it was really from the United States and from Obama administration that was really very honest and frank attempt to overcome the problems we had to face and look for something better. Not to be challenging each other only, not to be confronting each other, but to create a platform for better relations. Unfortunately, in Kremlin, they again perceive it as a gesture of weakness and as our uncertainty. Those attempts of some American or European politicians who are flying to Tbilisi and then having the very emotional speeches on the main square in Tbilisi, that was all what we actually were able to do. So the quite natural result of that is the Crimea. If Kremlin leaders were testing us all the time, what we are allowing them to do, they came to the conclusion that they could really expand, because we are not ready to defend ourselves and to defend our allies, those who are having ambitions to become part of NATO or European Union, that we would give up, that we would surrender, that we would actually abandon those countries like Georgia or Ukraine just for protecting ourselves. And the concrete situation we are living in now, today, is the result of that. But I don't want to be speaking only like a defeatist. I would say that thanks to Mr. Putin, today, we have United States back in Europe. We have a relatively united European Union. If Greece would not totally destroy the unity of European Union by this current situation, then thanks to Mr. Putin, who should have a statue in all capital cities of European Union, then as a guy who helped us to stick together. Thanks to him, we have a relative level of unity and ability to achieve common position. The policy of sanctions, I believe it's successful. Of course, we have a lot of European politicians who are useful idiots of Mr. Putin, saying that this is against our interests to have this policy of sanctions and this is unsuccessful and that we are suffering the most. I know that there is Ivana Smolenyova who recently published this very interesting study about the Russian propaganda. So those people are here saying that this is against our interests to be firm towards Russia, but I'm saying yes, it is in our interest to be firm, to show our ability to defend our values, and thanks to Mr. Putin, we unexpectedly achieved fantastic level of unity. And the other achievement of Mr. Putin is that suddenly we have here in Ukraine political nation, Ukrainian political nation. even those Ukrainians who can't speak Ukrainian, who speak Russian, became Ukrainian patriots, and many of them are ready to fight for their country and defend it, and to lose their lives because of new level of patriotism which I would not expect in a country like Ukraine. So again, thanks to Mr. Putin, we have now a political Ukrainian nation. I would conclude my introductory remarks by saying that I don't think that we are now in time when we can't do anything because we need to wait what Russia would do. I said it recently when we were in the United States having seminar in Atlantic Council, and I said it to my American friends who were saying that now after the midterm elections when Obama lost Congress, that he is going to be only kind of the lame duck, just, you know, focusing for Obamacare or for Cuban resettlement. And I would say, well, and I said it, you know, there were some other US presidents who lost in the second term, midterm elections, like Ronald Reagan, who used that situation for winning Cold War, like Bill Clinton, who lost Congress in second term in midterm elections, and he enlarged NATO. He used this situation for enlarging NATO, having the Republican Congress on his side. And I can imagine that President Obama, if he would really like to use this situation for something strategically very important, would use it by support of Republican Congress to move forward dramatically with this TTIP negotiations with Europeans, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which would be strategically very important. If you had a chance to see the speech of David Cameron in Globsec recently, he said it quite clearly. If we want to be secure, we need to be prosperous. And this TTIP is the way how to be the prosperous entity. It's, if I'm correctly counting, about 814 million people with very high purchasing power parity, if you compare it with China or Russia or some other parts of the world. Can you imagine this great power of free market without barriers of those 814 million people? No one would be able to beat us. We can't be defeated then. Of course, we in Europe need to move forward with these TTIP negotiations as well. We have our opponents here. Not all of them are Putin's useful idiots. Some of them are really convinced Greens or some leftists, and they have their problems with that. But I see it as a strategic imperative. We need to conclude it. We need to finalize it as soon as possible. And second suggestion would be to finish, to overcome this ban for exporting shale gas from the United States. Then I can imagine that the LNG would be quite important for part of the export of gas from the United States to Asia. Then the Asian capacities would be, actually not the Asian, the Asian demand would be not so high for the Middle East capacities. These Middle East capacities could be used in Europe, and our dependence on Russian gas and oil would be lower. Not fully overcome, but definitely much lower. And the ability of blackmailing of Russians, actually Putin's guys, because I'm making distinction between Russians and Putin's people, Putin's Russia. There are some Russians who really suffer the most now, and they are so-called Zapadniki, our Russians. They need to be supported. There are not many, only few of them, but they are there. So the Putin's Russia would be not able to blackmail Western Europe so much through their resources, natural resources. Of course, we have our problems here in Europe. It's a jihadism inside of our European Union and this fanatic form of Islamism. We have Islamic State outside. We need to fight with that together with the United States. We have our problems with the unexpected wave of migration, which is not so big, but there are some domestic consequences for the domestic policy, like a rise of extremism and populism. You can see how many politicians are using this card of migration now to become the only saviors of our civilization. So we need to take it seriously and look for the very realistic and concrete solutions. We have our problem with Greece and with their discipline to pay their debts. And of course, we have our problems with Russian propaganda, using a lot of European politicians, not only extremist politicians and populist politicians, but many of them who are in very high constitutional positions in EU countries to infiltrate our brains and our approach by defeatism, relativization, and they can absolutely perfectly use the ignorance of people and the laziness of people to educate and to learn. So this is another challenge we need to take seriously and face it and fight with that. And I believe that our combat would be successful, but well, it needs to provoke more and more people to get out from the lethargy and to start to be active. So that's my introduction, and now the floor is yours, and I'll try my best to answer your questions.